I thought I would help you continue the challenge of the day with some real kind of in-depth, maybe somewhat controversial discussion about charter school accountability. The session today is really about, how you as policymakers, policy influencers can leave here with some real strategies to make sure, paraphrasing Patricia and the Foundation's words, that we have the best charter schools, the best schools in the world. And there are a lot of different ways, obviously, that many of you are working on doing that. I want to start real briefly before I go to the panel, with just some overview to kind of set a context. And when I'm done, Jim Shelton, who all of you have bios and things in front of you and your book, but Jim is the Deputy Secretary for Innovation at the U.S. Department of Education, has had long, storied, successful history within this movement before his government days at the Gates Foundation. Nina Rees, to his left, currently President and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, a dear friend, committed person in the education reform space, and probably has done more to advance the cause of school choice and accountability than most of us in this room writ large. So thank you for being here, Nina and Jim. And then Todd, a state legislature from Indiana, whose leadership has really brought about one of the strongest education reform environments there, and as they tussle with how to continue to make it better and make it stronger. Our session leaders originally asked me to kind of talk briefly about what makes really a good law. And frankly, many of you have seen this, our charter school law rankings of the Center for Education Reform. Many of us analyze laws. If you're in a state that has a law, your state's in there. You could be Virginia down the F scale, sorry. Mississippi, kind of bad, sorry. You got to get on that. Indiana, California, Michigan, Colorado, you know who you are. You're better. You're still not 100%, but you're working towards that. And the components that make for a great law often have everything to do with what makes for great schools. And as we said when we started doing this 16 years ago, great schools come from great laws. So what is a great law? Lots of stuff you guys can go out there and research. Many of us up here have it. But great laws start with great programs that really truly allow for the flexibility and freedom with high levels of accountability that the charter school movement was promising. And the subject of accountability in charter schools today is, I think, fraught with some confusion today. And unlike when it first really began in the late 80s and early 90s to be a discussion. It's fraught with confusion, competing interests that are often not aligned to the original goals of the chartering movement. And I'm sure we'll have a discussion about this and whether or not we really fully agree, and would love to engage you in this conversation. As Ted Coldery, who really was a pioneer of charter schools from the 1980s, yeah, way back then, used to say, he reminded us that charters are not really a school, but a way of doing business. And at the core, a very simple idea was in play: to give teachers the flexibility to do their jobs and parents the opportunity to engage more directly in their child's education. I pulled a little piece from 1988 for you all to share, just a couple of little vignettes. So we all know that this isn't something new, and we're not really new to the party of wrestling what really makes great chartering. This is from a Minnesota study. Of course, it started in Minnesota. Citizens League Board of Directors. This is prepared by a group of people who were actually trying to pilot this notion way before there was even a law passed, November 17th, 1988. And I'll just throw this out here, a couple of just initial thoughts in this paper. Many teachers believe they know how to do a better job of educating their students, but they need to be freed from the constraints of an excessively rigid public school management system to do it. Parents concerned about the education of their children need and deserve a way to become involved in and informed about their children's schools. Informed and involved parents help make better schools. Now, this is back in 1988, he says. Most recent efforts at education reform throughout the nation are based on requiring the same system to meet tougher new standards. Sound familiar? Minnesota, in contrast, is taking an incentive and opportunities approach, giving schools a reason and a way to become better. Minnesota's difference should stay on its innovative course, chartering public schools that empower teachers to develop high-quality schooling opportunities, which include a commitment to integration, which was part of the reason it started. It should, throughout the state, allow teachers and school boards to talk about alternative structures for school governance, consider the value of negotiating terms for cooperatively managing day-to-day operations of school. A chartered school is one granted a charter and intended to be different in the way it delivers education and within broad guidelines to be autonomous. And it goes on to talk about a charter recognizes kids of differing abilities, they learn at different speeds, and teachers and schools should adapt to children's needs rather than requiring children to adapt to the standard system. So that was '88. But today, we now have, once again, almost like the conversation back in 1988, everyone from local schools to federal officials telling charters how they must comply with various benchmarks set and mandated along the way. These benchmarks are assumed to be good for kids and for all schools. But are they? And when I say good for kids in schools, I mean they're supposed to ensure that schools actually succeed at what they're doing, succeed for kids, and be accountable for their success or close. Much has been written about charter school closures. We've done some of the definitive work out there. That's one form of accountability, but what about the others? What is the right way to manage charter school accountability? What happens when the schools, their authorizers, and even their states fail to manage to high standards? The original idea was that education would be a marketplace in which the barrier to entry would be higher than for charter schools. Flexibility would be given in exchange for performance-based accountability. That performance would be measured against standards set for the school and in the state and eventually nationally, although the initial idea was that these were truly local schools. So as the charter schools opened, grew, scaled, we founded networks, other people founded schools, they experienced a shift in thinking. First, they were judged by their compact, their charter, that local idea. Next, they were judged how well they were performing against other schools. As new states adopted laws and new authorizers created, many of these institutions came up with additional ways of measuring and monitoring schools. States like Florida, Indiana created grades to measure all schools. External agencies, financial and otherwise, got into the game. Then there were the researchers using sometimes apples to apples comparisons and often apples to coconuts comparisons that have guided our thinking. The sand then continued to shift over the years. There were new state tests, eventually national mandates, AYP, and now we have the Common Core. And during each iteration and development in standards and assessments, when charter schools seem to fail, when charter schools are written about in the newspaper, when well-meaning state officials see or learn of a school that looks like it's gone awry, or worse, in a very few cases, a whole state seems to be without accountability anchor, the movement has reacted and caused policymakers, both friendly and unfriendly to the concept, to meddle in how charters are not only held accountable, but how they're designed and how they're permitted to operate. Indeed, most charter schools we talk about complain about the amount of paperwork to prove that they're doing everything from teaching reading to practicing fire drills is more akin to what they thought is more like a district than the charter they set out to create. And yet, many of them are doing that in the name of accountability that's been imposed by states in the name of performance to make sure we get those truly great schools. Today, some states close the doors of a school that has not met standards after 3 years, a response to perceived new accountability now in place in Ohio. Peggy was going to be with us today, but she was not able to make it because she's got legislative challenges at home. Some states peg charter school growth to the average of 3 years, when growth used to be determined by increases in achievement from year to year. So a charter school in Philadelphia who got a math score 1 year for their incoming grade of 28%, the next year got 38%, and the next year got 54%, doesn't show growth of 10 points and then almost 20 points respectively. It shows growth that's actually averaged, so instead of 54, they're actually pegged to achievement in the 30s. Others compare one third grade with 25 kids in a charter to a third grade cohort of 3,000 kids in a district and base their assessments on that, which often exposes real issues in a charter, but masks that averaged out achievement of thousands more of children in a district. These are our accountability measures in states across the country today. And so it's upon these varying and very different accountability systems that we permit the media and ourselves to call out charters, make very righteous comments sometimes about closing bad schools, when oftentimes we really don't have a clue about what's working and what's not in these schools. Some of those state lawmakers in Indiana and Florida have battled out this tension, taking seriously that contradiction between that first call for flexibility and this squeezing of a movement into one fixed way of doing business for all schools. We permit and indeed encourage states to do chartering differently. States that rank high for outcomes tend to be those that rank high in the strength of their charter law, providing maximum autonomy and governed outside of traditional systems. But in those states, lawmakers often complain, Democrats and Republicans, that they don't have enough control over outcomes, and they continue to push the structures created to come under one umbrella. We have state commissioners who say, I can be responsible for performance-based accountability. And then we go back to that 1988 piece that said, it's about educators, it's about parents, it's about high standards, but it's about flexibility. Is this accountability? What's the answer? Who does it right? Or are we willing to say we're not right yet? What's the measure of a great school, and who is actually capable of determining that? And can accountability for results be measured in different ways? Let's find out the answer to these questions while probing a little deeper about how we can come to agreement about the best way to ensure that we encourage and grow great learning opportunities for every child. Jim, let's hear from you.
All righty. Great initial thoughts to kind of kick us off. To be honest, my first reaction is I wish that it mattered more. The reality is that very few schools in the country, charter or otherwise, are closed down for performance academically. The majority of charter schools that close are closed for reasons of financial, fiscal irresponsibility in most cases. And in fact, if you compared the performance curves as a result of termination based on performance, it would look a lot like what we complain about the teacher curves look like for firing teachers because of performance. So regardless of whether the metrics are flawed or not, one of the first things that we have to figure out is how to get the political courage to actually use metrics to actually say, because you are not doing the fundamental job of educating children, however we decide to measure it, you deserve to close. That was one of the promises we made as a sector, as a charter sector, is we would have a different level of accountability for the autonomy that we received. Now, you can make arguments that needs to be extended, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think so. One of the first principles of innovation is fail quickly. We should be taking advantage of the opportunity that we have to really figure out how you do this, how you create the next generation of schools, and then make sure that we're actually following the core principle of failing quickly. The second thing I'd say is that, I think that where we have fallen down is that we as overall, education overall, has never really figured out how to be outcome focused. It has always been very input focused, always been about the description of what it is that makes for a good school. And because that lack of orientation doesn't exist in the sector overall, it actually didn't show up well, even in the context of the sector, the new charter sector that we were trying to create. And so when you have folks who are highly committed, members of authorizing bodies and things like that, who ostensibly, because of their participation, believe in chartering as a movement, what do they rely on? They rely on those definitions of what it is that makes for a quality school and the ways that it's going to be described, because the tools are not there to them, the understandings, the concepts are not there to them, to how to judge it some other way. And frankly, in a system where the likelihood is that you're going to close it if it doesn't work is low, people are more likely to be even more conservative. And so we're seeing that play out. The third thing is that we've seen very little experimentation, period, both on the side of people developing charters and on the side of folks who are determining what the metrics are over time that schools ought to be held accountable to. You know, we have our state policies and our federal policies and things like that, but we've had authorizers that have been around for almost 2 decades in some cases now, and yet you have seen very little experimentation with trying to develop new kinds of metrics, new leading indicators, new things that would let you start to understand the performance of a school in a very different way. I mean, why would it take the federal policy to move for growth, or state policy to move for growth, to actually show up in the accountability system that an authorizer is using with their charters? There's no reason that it should. Very easily could have been a part of these kinds of accountability systems early, and we just haven't seen it. So my first reaction is, I wish it mattered more. The second is, a lot of the things that we could do about it, we could do very quickly. They're all within our control. And then the third is, then, with that experimentation, it ought to be, and commitment, it would be very easy then to, I think, shift the wheel on the political side to get some of the policies changed.
So I agree to a large extent with what Jeanne and Jim said, but I'm going to put a slightly different kind of frame around it. First of all, according to the latest set of data that the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools is going to release tomorrow, we had about 150 charter schools close last year. You can, probably have your own opinions on whether that's a high number or a low number, but what struck me is that often when they do close, it's not something that, makes the news. It makes the news when you notice a school that's not doing well and you're having a hard time closing it because parents are arguing against it. So I do think from a reporting standpoint that it's important for the media to also capture those instances where the system is working and why it is that some of these charter schools are closing down. The second thing I wanted to mention is that as all of you know, not every charter school law was designed to close the achievement gap. States like Tennessee, for instance, have in their preamble the express, statement that the charter is there to close the achievement gap, but a lot of charter laws were created to create an atmosphere in which teachers and educators could create innovative schools. Other laws were created to simply give parents more options. So historically speaking, the notion of accountability and the way states are now testing their students and the fact that the No Child Left Behind Act came on the scene later on has had an impact on charter schools, but I think it's important to kind of go back historically and look at how these state laws were created and work with states to improve perhaps on some of the elements of their laws if accountability is something that is missing or is not as strong as it should have been perhaps when the law was put in place. And the last piece that I really want to highlight is the fact that, I've been on this job for about 3 months. I'm not new to charter schools, but I'm kind of looking at a lot of the information out there on school closures and what state charter school associations are doing to tackle this issue. And what's apparent to me is, and Jim kind of touched on this a little bit, is that there's just actually not a lot of data out there for us to make good informed decisions on which schools are truly doing a poor job versus those that perhaps are doing okay. But again, when you just look across the board at raw data, you might notice a school not doing well, but in reality, if you just take them in the medium that they're in compared to the neighboring public schools, they might actually be doing a good job. I'm not making excuses, but I think we need to have far more information at our disposal at the national level and to help states figure out how exactly to tackle this issue. In some cases, it could be that the state association decides we're going to identify the poorest performing charter schools and proactively go after them and try to close them down, either using a legislative tool and whatnot. In other places, you may just want to work with the authorizers. Those efforts at closing that have worked best oftentimes involve working very closely, having the authorizer work closely with the charter school to make sure that the charter school has been given notice ahead of time and that they have had enough time to know. It's kind of like firing someone, right? You kind of want to give them the notice. You're on a watch list. There is data behind why you're not doing well, and then slowly move them out of the process. Those types of instances tend not to capture as much attention, but I do think those are the better ways of approaching this issue than the more public instances where all of a sudden a school is poor performing, let's shut it down, and parents are on the street scrambling to figure out where to send their kids to school. And I'm a firm believer in parental choice, as Jeanne mentioned, and I also think we need to do a far better job of explaining to the families in these schools why is it that the school is not doing well and why we're shutting it down. So from a PR standpoint, it's our responsibility to educate them, to make sure that they are on our side and in favor of shutting a poor performing charter school and not opposing the closure. And then last but not least, I'd be remiss not to mention this, we are still, if you look at every study that's done out there, and I'm not using funding as an excuse, but charter schools continue to operate at a fraction of the cost of what it takes to educate a child in a public school. So it's about 81 cents on the dollar at the national level, 72 cents on the dollar in urban districts. So not only are they bringing in less funding and held to account by their authorizer around the terms of their charter, But in addition to that, they have, increasing rules and regulations they have to comport with from an accountability standpoint because they're public schools from states and the federal government. And at some point in time, when Jim was talking about the whole innovation aspect of it, I am not surprised that a lot of charter schools are not trying to be innovative, because as it stands, the burden on them is pretty high to make sure that they are, closing the achievement gap and doing a lot of things that require a more back to basics approach. You can't experiment too much with low-income children when the ceiling or the bar that you have to jump and get them to jump from is really high. So there's always going to be a tension between the innovation aspects of chartering and the accountability side. And I'm not quite sure what the right answer to that question is right now. And I understand you were not talking about pedagogical innovations, you're talking about just from a data standpoint, but I still think when you're really busy managing your school and trying to make sure the kids are learning how to read, I think it's hard to then think of other ways to be innovative. So.
And so Todd, as you start putting forth your thoughts, I wonder if you could also throw into the mix what I sense might be a little bit of a rub between Jim and Nina. Okay, so Jim, I hear you. We need high accountability. It doesn't matter as much as it should. Nina's sort of saying, well, it does seem to matter, but there's also all these other obstacles, right? So how's that playing at the local level when you actually see your schools that your laws and your amendments have created? Whether it's in the core of Fort Wayne and Indianapolis, where Lord knows there have been people trying to shut those schools down upon opening, right? So what kind of challenge does that bring? And what are the great schools doing, and what are the not so great schools doing that we could learn from?
Well, this is an interesting topic because I think over the last 4 years of working on reform in Indiana, I think probably this has been the most challenging one. If I could count the number of hours I've talked to Tony about this, it would be in the thousands. So, I don't pretend to have any answers. It's interesting because, I do think there's a variety of different tensions in the system, and we're, it seems to me, at many times unprepared to address. First of all, unfortunately, in our state, charters were kind of branded when they were promoted as being less expensive, very innovative and high performing. And so it goes back to what Nina said, right? So what we didn't do, we didn't provide local funding. So they don't receive any of the property tax funding for capital, debt, transportation, and other funding. They just get state funding. So we decided at that point we were going to tie their arms behind their back and say, well, now go succeed. And that didn't make sense. And unfortunately, there are those that just want to keep that same funding model in place. We then also allowed, if I would have a criticism in the entire discussion, largely be at authorizers, who I think have failed to take action. When we create a state charter school board, we have a great executive director in Claire Fiddy and Green who sit in the room, and they ran out of people, so they made me chair. And they said, what I said to Claire was, let's really think about this from an authorizer perspective. And let's think about the fact of what can we do to provide these schools with the greatest level of academic freedom. Get rid of, if you look at our accountability metrics, they are entirely outcome-based. I don't care how many fire drills you do. I don't care, anything else that you're doing. Just how are our kids performing? Is there a pathway that we're seeing growth? There's check-in points so we know that you're gonna, that the school knows if they're in real trouble. And what we tried to do was put the accountability to front end of the discussion, because what I've seen from almost every authorizer is when a bunch of parents show up in a room this size and they're upset because you're gonna close what is a terribly underperforming school, it is very hard for an authorizer to do it. And it's frankly very hard because the authorizer wants to keep that back-end administrative fee coming through the door so they can, they can fund their back office. If not for the change in Tony's position, one of the things I was prepared to do was to walk in and offer a bill that, if you're, in our voucher bill, if you're a D or F school after 3 years, you can't accept new voucher students. Well, the same thing should go for charter schools. Pick the appropriate year. We can have a policy debate on whether it's 3, 5, 7 years. But, you know, why would you continue to allow an authorizer to accept administrative fees? So my idea was, you know, after 5 years, if it's a D or F school, the authorizer can't accept administrative fees. Guess what? I think it caused some action by the authorizers, right? They either make sure the school gets better or they close down the low-performing school. I think we have to have a little bit of a you know, I don't think, and I would even say this, I would put myself in this category. Have we been fair about the accountability metrics? With the fact you're starting a new school, finding leadership that can do all the things that start a new school is challenging, both at the principal level and also at the board level. I mean, why do a lot of charter schools fail? Because they have a terrible governance structure and governance leadership. And so, you know, there has to be an incubation time for these schools to grow and to learn. And I think the authorizers have to do a better job of providing support to that. But I think what we've tended to do in the system, like in charter schools, what we've done in education, Jeanne, is we've really allowed the decision to be made at the back end and not at the front end. You know, we don't set up the pathway of what we expect success to look like. So it's a yes/no determination instead of it being, you know, how do I feel determination after X number of years. And so we put an undue amount of stress on the back end of the system instead of making the hard decision, you know, about what our expectations really should be. So, you know, and I would say lastly, before we really have to have a national funding discussion. I mean, and because this idea that you know, you're going to build something out of the ground and you're going to, mind you, you're going to begin educating kids. You traditionally come into the schools behind, and we're going to build the support system for these kids. At the same time, I've got to go raise money to build the structure. I mean, it is really, you know, a testament to the great schools that they succeeded in this environment. It is not an environment that you know, if I were to sit down with any reasonable person and say, here are all your barriers, you know, they would think success would be likely. And then finally, just one other final thing. We look at scale too late in the game. You know, one of the things that we've tried to do in Indiana around our charter school board is say, let's talk about replication early. Not, you know, so I'm sorry if you're running a 300 student charter school, I'm about ready to offend you. But, you know, it's hard for me as a policymaker when we have 1 million kids in public schools in Indiana, many of which are in underperforming schools, to get that excited about creating a bunch of, you know, one-offs. And one of the things that we try to do early on in our application process is tell us how you're going to get to scale. Tell us how you're going to replicate. Now, does that mean they're going to do it? Maybe we may not want them to, but I at least wanted to get the discussion going in the front end so they start thinking about it instead of having to go beg them 3, 5, 7 years later, hey, how can you replicate? So that was another idea we had. But again, the accountability model has to allow for kind of that breadth of discussion.
Thank you, Todd, Nina, and Jim. You know, this is actually, all of your comments are probably the most serious and contextual that I've heard or seen on a discussion about accountability at most conferences in a long time, because you all hit on sort of 3 key things that I want to kind of tease out. I mean, one, this session is about money too, and let's talk about money. Again, there was a notion, there's a lot of talk about child-centered schools, right, and money following kids, and yet we're supposedly advanced and progressive in the movement, and what happened to that idea of strapping the same amount of money on the backpack of every child and having that literally delivered in true equity? And yet time and time again, lawmakers are pressed into these devil's bargains about, you know, Ed Seltzer from Georgia earlier, Setzler said, you know, we had to deal just with state funding. We can't fight that local piece. And so school districts run to sue and close down and hurt traditional or charter schools, and yet, and as Nina said, I mean, 70 cents on the dollar more or less in inner cities, 81 on the dollar. I mean, that's really alarming and something we don't talk about enough. And I'm actually wondering if anybody else is tired of saying what Nina has said, which is, I know it's not an excuse, but let me just tell you that money matters. Why do we have to apologize for saying that's actually an excuse? It's a problem, it's a flaw, it's an impediment, right? So that's kind of something I think we should tease out. How do we fix that? And Todd, raising authorizers, amen. right? It starts at the front end. What did you bring in? What was your incentive for bringing them in? How do you make sure that those schools are doing well? And instead of talking about failure and a reclosing, it was a financial. I mean, finances rear their ugly head long before performance is a problem, right? You don't shop in a store where, like, people are, like, chewing gum and, like, doing really unhealthy things no matter what they're selling, and they'll close down, and you're probably likely their product sucked too, right, to be frank. But that's why charters are closing before academics, but you're right to worry about that because we're coming to you with our handout saying, give us money, Mr. Secretary, right? Give us help, give us money, and you have to say, okay, if I got to give you money, I got to regulate you. So then you say to states, well, we want to see best practice authorizing. So everyone scurries around and throws rules on schools, and then to Nina's point, they go, well, wait a minute. We don't have these resources to try to figure this out. Why isn't the authorizer doing more? So are we creating a system that is expecting to put them in a box? Are we defining accountability because it's much easier by saying, hey, we have an idea. Let's just all have the same SEA, LEA school system we used to have. What do we do about that? Do we have it? Are you to blame, Jim, at the federal level, or are we to blame for coming to you and continuing to demand that you help us help ourselves?
That was a real question? Okay.
Sort of.
Got it.
They asked me to moderate, I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. So two things. One is, the reality is that this is interesting for me to pay attention to because I didn't realize it until I got there. The federal government basically plays at the front end on charters, right? We provide startup funding. And the states that are eligible meet requirements for, now, especially these are new, and these are our responsibility around what they've done to ensure quality authorizing. Once schools are up and running, it is all state, all local authorizer. That's how the game plays out. So there's not a lot that people come back to us ever to ask us about, other than the rest of the regulatory system that covers all public schools. And we can have a conversation about the impact that that has, but on charters, there's just not a lot for us to do other than help with the startup. And some states opt out of that. They opt out of it for a variety of reasons. Some of them want to have differential lotteries, which is, I think, something that we all need to talk about as a community because it cuts both ways. You can't overserve a population of high need if you wanted to either. So with that established, let me then touch on a couple of the other issues. The question of whether money matters, money matters significantly, and this is one of the things that I think is interesting, that we oftentimes talk about it in terms of the impact that it has on the schools that are operating, but anyone who's been in the reform movement for a long time also talks about, frankly, the issue of the lack of people of color in the movement. And I think that one thing that doesn't get talked about is in a place where you don't get access to capital dollars and you have to raise a significant amount of your operating dollars, the amount of social capital you have and the access to capital that you have from private sources also impacts your ability to successfully open a school. So by definition, the lack of social capital problem that we're trying to fix is hindering the full participation of the communities that we want to see better represented in the movement. That's another part of the conversation. I actually don't ever talk about things I don't hear raised, and it, I think, is one of those opportunities to find common ground with a constituency that might not always be willing to participate in the conversation because they don't see, frankly, what's in it for them. The folks who open the schools don't look like them. Sometimes the people who open the schools say it's much better than what you had before, but it's still not quite what they want. So I think there's an opportunity to talk about money, not just in absolute terms, but the impact it has on equity issues.
Yeah, I want to make sure I don't sound like some wild-eyed spending machine, because I'm certainly not. When I think about the funding issue, I really do think charters have an extraordinarily important, I hate to say obligation, because that's not the right word, but role to play in this sense of how do you educate innovatively for less. I mean, I challenge you, and my state's in a lot better fiscal position than a lot of states, but we can't afford the traditional educational system of today. I mean, I hate to break it to our traditional educators, if any of them are in the room, but I mean, we just can't continue to pump 3-4% new dollars in the system. We just aren't growing at that rate. So I think that the interesting thing about charters is, and some of them are doing this, I mean, because of the blended model and some of the other innovation, is they can actually drive down the cost of the long-term of the operational, or excuse me, let's call it the educational delivery cost, which is what we really can't afford. But what we're asking them to do is we don't see that because we don't fund the operational cost of buildings and transportation and capital improvements and those types of things. So unfortunately, we don't get the true picture. And I think there's a real opportunity there. I mean, charters need to show the way because they've, in most instances, when we don't try and overregulate them, they really have the potential to show us how do you educate kids at a cost that, frankly, our economy can afford in the next, decade or two. So, I think, as we talk about it, I mean, are we end up, cutting off our nose to spite our face because we haven't, we're starving them early without getting both the academic and the cost benefits of what they can provide to us in the long term.
And Nina, before you jump in, let me just get Todd to answer one more thing. What about that regulatory creep that schools are complaining about that's costing money? Whether perceived or real, they are believing that they have to do things they never really had to do. And Jim, to your point, you're right, you technically don't have any other authority besides giving out money, but the department is measuring whether or not states supposedly have best practice authorizing, and I don't know how you do that sitting in Washington. I never could when I was in that seat. I know Nina never felt comfortable making that decision. So by having those words there, is it doing more than exposing best practice authorizing? Is it really like, oh, we're going to have to count how many times you reviewed an application, and that becomes best practice authorizing, or is perceived that way by the state who asks? Because all these policies and rules are flawed. Again, not your fault, but somehow we're inviting that kind of thing.
Well, but I'd even say the regulatory creep that I think every legislator in person has worked in a DOE has felt has been this. I mean, we passed a third grade reading retention law in Indiana, and with, I think, tremendous results. But one of the interesting things was, we tried to just make it outcome driven, but guess what? The immediate question was, well, tell us how we get better. So then guess what we do? We write a bunch of, we're required by the legislature to write a bunch of regulations to tell these schools how to get better. And then you run into the competition of, well, if it's good enough for public, then, and again, these are public dollars falling kids at charter schools, and guess who gets caught up in that regulatory creep? The charter schools. So, I mean, it is problematic, and we've struggled with this. I bet you every legislator in here has wanted to run a dereg bill, and then because schools say how expensive regulations are, and then you ask them, well, what regulations would you like to get out of? And you get to hear crickets chirp, because there's really not one, because they don't want the expectations of the burden. They'd rather blame someone else. So I think I really, Jeanne, think this is a key issue, and I think the charter school community has got to, be aggressive, not just in protecting their own rights, but somehow informing the other public schools on this regulatory scope creep that happens by every legislative body and rulemaking authority.
Yeah.
Do you want Jim to answer that, or should I go ahead? So, I mean, you mentioned so many different things, I don't even know where to start, Jeanne, but here's one thing that I think is pretty important. So we've been doing authorizing for 20 years now. So within the 20 years, with the number of authorizers out there, there are just a lot of best practices out there that can be replicated immediately. I mean, the art of identifying individuals who can operate good schools, there's now, I think there's got to be a science to it by now. If you were running an HR department, you would kind of know, okay, these types of people are going to do a better job than others. Some of it is going to be business acumen. In other cases, you may want to take a chance with someone who, do your psychometric research and figure out what it is. So I think we really need to hone in from an accountability standpoint on what we can do at the state level to increase the quality of the authorizers and get a lot of the authorizers who are in the business out of it. I mean, those who are not doing a good job, a lot of the districts that are just authorizing one school at a time. I mean, I don't know, I don't want to make sweeping judgments at the federal level, but I think a lot of these individuals should not be in the business of authorizing schools. I also don't know, and this is something NACSA has put forth, it's a question on the table, whether you need to have, 5 or 6 authorizers. Maybe just having a couple is enough, because what happens, and I know it's happened in Indiana, for instance, is you have an operator who didn't get a charter with one authorizer, and they go shop their application around until someone says yes. So you want to diminish those instances as much as possible. So on the fiscal issue, I would just say this. I mean, I agree with you that we need to demonstrate how we can do more with less, but I also don't like the notion of going down this path of saying that too much, because I do think educating disadvantaged children is going to be expensive, and it's going to require much more time and effort. And the types of people you need to attract, that you want to attract, I do think they need to be incentivized to stay in those systems for a long time in order to make a difference. I understand the hybrid model may save you some money, but even then, I used to work at a for-profit company that was engaged in the online business, and in Georgia and South Carolina, I mean, our key impediment was that we had gone into these states at a very low per pupil allocation, and now that we were trying to make an argument for raising that per pupil allocation to make sure that local funding was following children, people were making the case that, well, 4 years ago you were fine with this amount. Why is it that now all of a sudden you've decided it costs twice as much to educate kids? So we just need to be careful in not lowballing the true cost of educating, especially children who are left behind.
Jim, you want to jump on that?
I mean, frankly, everything that's been said has been so on point. I don't really have a lot to add. I'd like for us to talk about the other side of accountability. Oftentimes what I don't see enough is truly differentiated accountability, where the high-performing schools are actually given much more freedom and flexibility, are given expedited authorization for new charters, are alleviated of additional burdens on reporting, and all of the different things that once you start to see a high performer demonstrate that they are a high performer, there ought to be some benefit to that. They ought to, in any market outside of our system, they would have access to additional capital. They would have access to more freedom and flexibility to actually truly be innovative. And they would be the ones who would, frankly, be the ones most likely to take the chances. There's one of the guys who I paid a lot of attention to when I started getting into education was a old school educator named Rudy Crew, who used to be the chancellor of New York City. And I remember when I was at Gates, he'd say, I really would like your dollars to do the innovation work you want me to do in my high schools, but you want me to do it in my worst performing schools. And that doesn't make any sense at all. I don't have capacity there. Where I have capacity is in my relatively high performing schools. Still high need, but that's where I need it is the most. And I think that there's something to be learned from that philosophy as we think about how to both accelerate the growth of this sector and to allow people the space and opportunity to really be innovative because they demonstrated they have the capacity to get it done.
I think those are three great takeaways before we go to questions. Increase the quality of authorizers and maybe consider shutting down those with the kinds of suggestions Todd was coming up. I think those are essential. It sounds like differentiated accountability. Jim, great idea for policymakers to take away. What else? You have a question back here. Tell us who you are and why you're asking.
It's on. It's on.
Yeah.
Well, I walked up here because I was disappointed in the first half of the discussion where it sounded like accountability means we're going to close the worst performing schools or fire the bottom teachers. It's only a stick and not a carrot. And whereas Jim had talked about data, and I'm glad you made the last comment because the data is neutral. It doesn't take political sides, as Governor Bush said. And certainly, if you look at any management textbook for the last 40 years, it says if you want to improve things, you need to measure. But you also talked about a conflict between accountability and innovation. And if you ask a mid-level manager in a large bureaucracy, how do you not get fired? Well, their answer is going to be, I don't make change. I can't take risks. And we have a system that's set up to discourage innovation, especially if you have only the stick of the threat of being fired. If we had metrics that could measure success, so I'll throw out one that combines the concept of money, which does matter, and results, student achievement per dollar. So if you can get a student to learn 1.5 times the material in one calendar year, you've had a huge success. You've had a huge achievement at a fixed cost, or if you reduce the cost for the same amount of education. And then if we had incentives that rewarded people, so this is what the private sector does to fuel innovation, is people will get bonuses, they get some personal rewards and some rewards for their company or their community. If that's in place, then you also get a whole chain of other innovations. So if you told Nike, if you build a new factory, you want to build shoes, and you don't recover the cost for 5 more years, but after that you'll save 30%. They would take that investment. But we don't take those long-term investments now because we don't have the incentives to take those risks and get the upside. So from the point of view of Silicon Valley and venture capitalists who have tons of capital waiting to invest in schools, one of the reasons why that doesn't happen is because they don't have that incentives aligned with the results, and so there's no incentive for people to propose new products and bring them in.
So we're losing risk. I've heard this a couple of times from people at this conference as well. People are getting really concerned. It's sort of like, if I might use a dating analogy, like you got burned, so really the next guy that comes around that wants to take you out, you're like, I don't really think you like me very much, because after all, you look and sound kind of like the last one, and so you just don't go out. So now there are authorizers not approving schools. I know, probably a lousy analogy, but I like my dating analogies. Now there are some schools out there, they're not getting approved because the local authorizer isn't sure they'll work in that state. And so Nina, I want to pull you in on this because you've been doing this a long time. You've been to a lot of schools like some of us. Remember we were hearing and reading these great stories several years ago in the media about these innovations and New Country Day School, which found the mutant frogs in the water because they spent most of the time outside. And of course, digital learning came about from there. And many people thought Back to Basics was actually kind of innovative because we weren't doing it for a long time. And then all of a sudden we had this kind of, oh, there's closures. And now the news is like talking about closures, and all of a sudden no one's really innovating. Is there a relationship between that stick that he was talking about, I think the gentleman from Juneau, and why we're in this predicament, and are we bringing that on ourselves?
I don't know. I mean, I think that, as I said earlier, a lot has changed since charter laws first passed 20 years ago in terms of what we expect our traditional public schools to do. So the bar on everyone has increased quite a bit. So in that process, and I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question properly, maybe others can tackle that. I think that what we have lost sight on is that, charters were always kind of based on this notion that you're going to get this freedom in exchange. You're going to, you're going to be accountable for the results that you said you were going to be held accountable to when you signed your charter agreement. And so where the confusion has arisen, I think, has had to do with the fact that people are noticing some instances where charter schools are perhaps not being held up to that standard that we're now holding the traditional public schools against. I don't know if,
I was just going to say, I agree with the point that was made. I think this goes back to a broader discussion around around performance-based funding. I mean, if you have a really true performance-based funding model, you begin to address this, and by the way, this is for charters or traditional schools. Because it does feel like right now accountability is the stick, and the only way to add the carrot would be to recognize and reward great student performance through a performance-based funding model that has, again, another attention associated with it, which is when you talk to charter schools and they look at moving in your state, one of the first questions they ask is, so what's your average per pupil? Because they need to run, they need to understand how they're going to staff, they need to understand their performance. But I think that gets a lot closer to being a carrot than just a stick of accountability. I'd also say we thought a lot, maybe even way too much about this, but one of the interesting things to me is we tried to recruit charters into Indiana, was that when they have to have, so they can go borrow money, they can talk to their investors, whether it's the bank or private capital, about how long can they sign a lease for a building, or if they go buy, were they sure that they can how long are they sure to be around, right? So they can give that type of security to the bank. And so I think policymakers have to really think through that. I would tell you, I would not disagree with what the gentleman said, that we've inhibited innovation in some ways. The only thing I'd ever say that would be contrary to that is I think we're all doing it because we're doing what we're truly in the best interest of, trying to do it in the best interest of a child. And I mean, and so the idea of having a cruddy school stick around for X number of years is just kind of a hard thing to swallow, but maybe we just should swallow a little better.
But I do think it has hindered innovation to a large extent, and I don't know, again, if it's because of the accountability or something else. So a couple of things. So a lot of the individuals that I think should be attracted to the space are now not coming into the space for whatever reason. Maybe it's because of the bureaucracy, headaches, I don't know. So we need to change that discussion, but I think that the more we talk about charters being in place to close the gap and raise student achievement and be held to these higher standards, and they're not making enough money, I think that's going to discourage a lot of people from entering. And to the extent you are in the space, you are just going to play it safe, quite frankly. I mean, you're not going to experiment with your curriculum too much to see if it works or not. It's true that if you go to the suburbs, perhaps there are some opportunities, and I don't know if there are some innovations in the suburbs. And the other problem we also have is that, I don't know what people's definition of innovation is anymore. Yeah. I think that a lot of things that people consider to be innovative are probably pretty traditional, or things that you definitely see in traditional public schools and private schools in a lot of instances. So we haven't really gotten out of that box.
Well, and look at the lack of innovation in the private school market.
Yeah.
I mean.
So, and even with hybrid, you're talking about innovations in the delivery of education. So again, you're not getting at the core of what I always thought chartering was going to do, which is coming up with different ways of teaching and learning.
So I want to let you get to the next question, but I do think that we are missing an opportunity to rethink accountability to inspire innovation. Steve, you didn't introduce yourself, which Steve is one of the co-founders of Zynga, so anybody in here who's ever played Angry Birds or any of those games, you can blame him. But also those things are driven by, as you probably guess, highly sophisticated data architectures and systems. Mm-hmm. And we now have, especially as we move into the world of virtual schools and blended schools, where the basic activity of day-to-day then can give you a lot of information about are people actually showing up? What level of activity do they have? Are they making progress? You don't have to wait as long to find out if things are working or not before you can make supportive adjustments or interventions, as the case may be. And I think we need to really start to take those things into consideration. And I will tell you, especially, I want to talk to the state policymakers right now. We've got to figure this out quickly for virtual schools, because they can grow so quickly and put so many public dollars at risk that if we don't figure out how to identify very quickly whether they are doing as promised, then we will wind up with, talk about the stories in the paper. There will be many stories in the paper, and they will be so disastrous, both in terms of the number of students and the number of dollars impacted, that it'll be almost impossible to recover. And your point about data is important, Jim. But the reality is we think data is commissioning studies that take an aggregate number of kids and average them out and make some conclusions. Data, if you're in Walmart, is how many people came into the room, got the red folders off the shelf, left, liked the price break, and how many people did that at 3,000 stores across the country. That's my point. At real time. That's exactly my point. We now have access to a level of data that we've never had before. We don't have to rely on the same old aggregate metrics that we had before. Frankly, even with the aggregate information, we weren't looking at the right things. We haven't been looking at growth. There's plenty of opportunity now to look at individual students, individual student growth, and to be able to see activity on a very micro level. There's no reason that we have to limit ourselves to what we were able to do when we started this 20 years ago. Yes, sir.
Hi, Jameson Taylor, Mississippi Center for Public Policy. And motivation behind my question is we'd like to see a great charter school law passed in Mississippi. Todd, you spoke about trying to set up a pathway for success on the front end as far as authorizers go. But at the same time, I'm hearing concerns about accountability stifling innovation. And when you say set that up, what I start to think about is, okay, we need something in the law that is going to bring more accountability or introduce more standards as far as what a charter school board should look like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So could you elaborate upon what you mean by setting up a pathway of success on the front end?
Yeah, so we took the approach that we created a clear set of outcome-based metrics to determine what once a school is approved, and obviously they know that if you go to our website, they can read what those metrics look like. But what those outcomes are expected for them to be reauthorized. And I think it allows two things. One, it sets the expectation on the front end for everybody, for all the players, the authorizer, for the charter school. But two is it takes away the emotional response. I'll say this now. We'll see what happens once actually rubber meets the road a few years from now. But the intent is to put the board in frankly a box to say this is the data, because this is like the previous gentleman. I'm a bit of a data nut, and here's the data. Here's what's expected. Here's how you met these outcomes. If you didn't meet these outcomes, here's what you should expect the action the charter school board will take. I would tell you that. I'm not sure. I think I'd put it in a legislative language. I do think authorizers, because I do think authorizers need to have this flexibility to think about the innovation issues. I mean, I've probably grappled with this one as much as anything about, what's the proper amount of time to allow a school. I'm frustrated by the lack of what I perceive to be innovation in all the alternative school markets. So I don't want to do anything to stifle it, but I think it's just setting up a clear set of expectations, getting the right people on the charter school board, and then any authorizer. I mean, any of this is only as good as the leadership. I mean, that's the honest truth about schools. It's about policies. It's about government. I mean, it is only as good as the leadership. But we've just tried to set the bar on the front end, a relatively high. Some would argue, my friends would argue, would be a relatively low bar on the front end to get in, but a high bar for expectations.
And there are some best practice authorizers out there. I mean, a lot of people will claim that they're all over the place, but, we point to SUNY, Central Michigan University, DC Charter School Board, Colorado's done an exemplary job, and most of those groups created their own performance benchmarks before anyone told them to do it, and they self-police. And they have great fixation to leadership and results. And so a lot of people are pushing back on this notion that you have to have these top-down new state laws that say have these kind of people on boards, do this, do that. And in Ohio, if Peggy were here, she would probably say what I witnessed with school board members, their charter school board members recently, which is they're hiring field directors just to count widgets. They're basically becoming districts because it was the overarching response to what they perceived as a bad accountability system to start.
Can I want another thing in this? If you're going to pass a charter school law, you better give a tremendous amount of thought about how you're going to recruit charter school board members. Because I think, at least in our state, we've dropped the ball on that, and that's been about any charter school. I'm sure you guys have seen this nationally. That's closed or underperformed, you could probably take a pretty doggone good look at their board and realize that that's what was going to happen.
Just like districts.
Can I add one more point on that one in particular? When you are making laws, if you make laws that make it difficult for good boards to manage more than one school, to oversee more than one school, you are shooting yourself in the foot. Yeah. It is just that simple. Allowing boards to scale is one of the easiest things that you can do to support high-quality schools.
Great point. Randy.
Randy DeHoff from Colorado Go Academy and formerly Charter School Institute out there. I want to pick on the data piece and the whole issue of innovation versus accountability. And I would argue that in the past, maybe it started with the federal government and the accountability system and No Child Left Behind, but by now the states have really overtaken that this is the data we will use to hold you accountable. And I would argue that use of data is really what hinders innovation. And maybe give you 3 quick examples and then ask you to respond to it. First, it's charter school that says we want to be competency-based. So if we have an 11-year-old that's a whiz at math and he's performing at the 7th grade level, but he's struggling with literacy and he's only reading at the 3rd and a half, 4th grade level, here's how we're going to measure that and hold them accountable, and the authorizer in the state says, that's great, but we're still going to make every 11th grader take the 5th grade test, and we're going to hold you accountable on that data. That data is not valid for what that school was trying to do. Go Academy, the dropped out, the teen parents, the high-risk youth. We're evaluated on a 9th and 10th grade state assessment that covers maybe for growth 15 to 20% of our students. We are held accountable on that data, which is invalid, especially since most of the kids coming in are so far behind. The state test is only valid for a 2 to 3 grade level range. If you have a kid that's 3 grade levels below, that data doesn't tell you anything. So, I forget what the third example was, but
Don't worry about it, got
similar
it.
situation. How do we get around that where the school comes in and says, here's the innovation we want to do.
Got it.
Here's how you hold us accountable.
Okay,
But
awesome. Thanks, Randy. Who wants to take that?
Just really quickly, I mean, I'm glad you raised it because this shows a place where the broader reform movement and the choice movement have common interests, right? The issue of competency-based progress and credit is one that cuts across the entire education system. It's one that will unleash innovation regardless of the sector. That is something where there's a bunch of people with common cause on it, and state policymakers should be trying to figure out how to get it done. When I was at the Gates Foundation, the last thing I did before I left was to do the strategy for next generation learning or whatever. There were two things that unlocked innovation. One, people may not be happy to hear, is having states have very similar standards, which lets things scale more quickly. The second is competency-based progress, because it's one thing that actually aligns all the incentives for better, faster, cheaper. So common cause around that issue, it's not a charter issue, it is actually a state policy around accountability systems. And I would say similarly, the lack of flexibility for accountability on alternative settings, especially those students who have dropped out of the system and come back, is also something that plagues the entire education system. The alternative school system, the system for alternative kids in New York had to work with the state to figure out what the right metrics would be for that. And I think it's something that state legislatures should help a lot with in terms of creating space and opportunity so we can get these kids back in school and help the schools have the incentive to do so.
We have Goodwill Industries in Indiana that's taken a bunch of they've opened schools for kids that have dropped out and they want to come back and complete their high school degree. So that also presented an issue regarding accountability. And, you know, what we did was we just met with them and worked on the accountability model that we felt met our needs and set the right expectations for them. So I think the authorizer has to be open for what is going to be unique conversations among different schools and different school types, serving different types of students.
I have a question for Jim. Since you guys have been giving away these waivers, do you ever foresee a scenario in which you could conceivably give a waiver to a state that was interested in giving its charter schools a waiver from the testing requirements of the federal law if they had a better test or another mechanism to measure their students' progress? Do you think that's a good idea? And B, do you foresee that ever taking off?
I mean, can I foresee it? Yeah. The thing, frankly, that I'm most concerned about is that we've seen a little bit of inattention to the charter sector among the applications, not thinking through how the things that they are talking about doing would actually impact the charters in their state. So I'd first like to see that paid attention to, and then I think that, not a lot is expected to happen with the ESCA reauthorization, but if you look at the blueprint that the Secretary put out, it basically called for states to actually figure out how to create innovation zones among sets of schools, especially their high-performing schools, where they had differentiated accountability systems and they figured out how to do this kind of stuff. I think in particular, this Secretary is very interested in figuring out how you create space and opportunity to figure out how to do this stuff better. So I can't speak for the department on whether one state or another would be successful with their application, but what I can say is the general posture is, especially when there's the intention of stimulating high performance, excellence, and equity, and innovation, that this Secretary is about as open to it as, and you'll hear him tomorrow. I mean, he always is pushing harder.
And what the policymakers, I think, in the room should know is you often rely upon your intermediary organizations, the kind of groups that Nina's group represents and some that we work with, to step up and say, we want to be part of this, but they're just as fearful, frankly, of that stick as the individual schools, and they are so and I'm just going to use this phrase, they're so beaten up into thinking that if they don't stand up every day and proclaim, we have bad schools, I'm going to close, that they're being irresponsible. Funders, frankly, some of mine, I've told them this to their face, are causing that. What are you doing about closing schools, as opposed to what are you doing about that excellence that you earlier said? So they're not showing up in these applications, frankly, because they're not inviting it. They're not asking, how do we make sure we get in there? And they're perceived as wanting something different that nobody else wants. And so the policymakers here have to step up and become part of that process of federal governing, of waivers, of flexibility, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
So, Jeanne, I want to push you on that, because as somebody who is very much a believer in the importance of choice and the charter movement and all that good stuff, actively involved, I can say as a sector, we have failed dismally at shutting down our worst-performing schools. And it is, and I would say personally, this is not a department perspective, I would say personally, it is a complete failure of courage. And that failure of courage, political will, political expediency, whatever you want to call it, causes schools and has caused schools that we know are not serving kids well to stay open. That is morally reprehensible. So I lead with that because I know it is hard. It is hard to say, we are going to close the school that your child goes to. It is going to be bad. People are going to have to move. It is hard to do that, but people need to do it.
But let me restate this, Jim. There's no one in this room that I know, and myself least of all, that is saying no one should say we have accountability issues. What I abhor, which is not courageous, is standing up and saying we need to close schools without having the data we talked about, without really knowing where the problem lies, without having a solution, because we have been browbeat into believing that if we don't say that, we're not courageous. So if 750 charter schools have closed in the last 8 years, 150 just this year according to Nina, and if people are taking the accountability movement seriously, we should also be saying, what do we do? Where's the great schools? What are we doing to keep them? What are we doing to thrive? Agreed. And stop washing your dirty laundry in public saying, well, 30% of the schools in my state have to close. And when we ask, how do you know that? They go, well, the data was put out by the department. Like, in other words, we're not into the data. And we have advocates across the country who feel very pressured to say this, even though they don't know what those schools are, and they feel like it's a hue and cry.
But can I, so I'm going to push.
That's the tension. I'm not saying it's not bad.
Yeah, so I'm going to push on that for just 1 second, because I think that I struggle with the fact, first of all, when we talk about the data, we have to be careful, because like in most states, the data is a student assessment, that is a state assessment, right? Which is an extraordinarily low bar, extraordinarily low. I mean, you know, we have states that they have 75+ % of their kids pass the state assessment, but then they take a college test and you find that 18% of them are really college ready. So I mean, the bar for using state assessment is a pretty low bar for all schools. But what I struggle with even more is this. Why I love choice, and I love it, you know, frankly, private and public school choice, is that we should have a higher expectation for accountability in the new system than we do for the old. And too many times, I think there's been a conversation that says, well, let's just compare the old system. We want to be compared back to the traditional system, not what I'd call the secondary system I so frankly believe in. And so, you know, for me, I think as a charter advocate, and I consider myself one, the best way I advocate for charters is to say, we want the bar set higher. We want the expectation to be higher, not that the expectation be the same, that we're not comparing ourselves against other low-performing schools, but what we're doing is we're saying, look, we're going to set a bar, and if we're going to do, we need to create policies, funding, regulatory, to support it. But at the end of the day, I think what differentiates the sector is the ability to say, if they are underperforming, we won't stand for it. This crud of letting these low-performing schools stay, the traditional low-performing schools stay open, we have no we can't justify that today. We can when we take action, the tough decision to say to a family, you know what, we, in good conscience, can't keep you in a school that's performing this poorly.
You know, last word.
Oh my God. I agree with you, Jeanne, to some extent, but I also think that, again, one of the things we're going to do at the Alliance is take a closer look at this issue and work with the state associations, because each and every one of them has actually started to think about this in a clever way. And there are ways to shift the charter from an ineffective charter school to an effective one easily, so that these stories you hear of families standing out, crying, saying the school has to stay open are not in the press so much. So I think we are actually farther than what people seem to think we are, and I think over the next couple of years we need to tackle this issue. We will tackle this issue, and hopefully next year, not only will we have more schools that have transferred their charters, but we will also be able to demonstrate to the general public school system how this is done, so that perhaps one day they can actually emulate some of our best practices, which was really the ultimate goal of chartering when it was first conceptualized. So.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you all.